She's too stupid to realize what's really going on. My son laughed. The words clung to the inside of my skull like mold creeping over old wallpaper. I was in the hallway, then not quite out of earshot, holding a basket of folded towels, my knees aching the way they did after the stroke. The laugh, his, was sharp, amused, but not cruel in a dramatic way. It was casual, effortless, the sort of cruelty that's second nature when you no longer see someone as a person. I stood there in silence, listening to the hum of the dishwasher and the click of the television in the living room where he spoke to his wife. And when she chuckled a soft breath through her nose, I knew it wasn't just him. It was both of them. They thought I didn't know. What a strange sensation to realize you've become invisible even inside your own skin. Not unseen in the poetic way people talk about, but truly unseen. Like a lamp or a potted plant. Useful when needed, forgotten otherwise. After my stroke last winter, the doctors told me I shouldn't live alone anymore. At first, my son and daughter-in-law were full of concern and affection. They insisted I move in. Family takes care of family, he had said, his voice so full of grown-up warmth. I had cried. Foolishly. I thought I was lucky. They set me up in the guest room. A tidy space all beige and quiet with a single window that faced the fence. It smelled faintly of carpet shampoo. I thought it was temporary. I told myself I'd recover, get stronger, maybe go back to my apartment once I could manage stairs again. But the weeks folded into each other like poorly stacked laundry, and I stayed. That's when the little things started. My purse wasn't where I left it. My Medicare card had been misplaced, and then found in a different drawer. He offered to take over managing my bank account. Just until you're back on your feet, Mom. And then somehow I no longer had the login. He'd wave it off. It's just easier this way until I stopped asking. They'd tell the neighbors I was forgetful. Oh, she means, well, my daughter-in-law would smile, patting my hand like I was a gentle senile aunt at a tea party. But she mixes things up sometimes. She forgets what she said. But I didn't forget. Not really. Maybe names took longer. Maybe I paused more often while searching for words. But I saw. I heard. And I remembered. I remembered when I was the one folding his clothes when he was 5 and furious that the shirt with the rocket ship was in the wash. I remembered the sleepless nights after his father died and how I juggled night shifts and parent-teacher meetings. I remembered selling my wedding ring to pay the mortgage that one summer when the union went on strike. I remembered all of it. So no, I wasn't stupid, but I had been slow to realize that comfort and control are not the same. That help can become a leash when it's given with conditions. That being needed is not the same as being loved. It was a Tuesday morning when I heard the laugh. That sentence. She's too stupid to realize what's really going on. And that was the morning I went into the small kitchen, made myself tea, and called the bank. I had to pretend I had forgotten the password, and the young man on the phone was patient, guiding me through the reset process. I had enough clarity in my voice that he didn't question my authority. Once I got in, I stared at the screen. My money, what was left of it, was pooled into a joint account I hadn't realized existed. There were transfers, regular ones, little sums going from my retirement into utilities, groceries, and miscellaneous charges labeled home expenses. But they weren't small enough to ignore, and certainly not small enough to match what they'd told me. "You're not paying for anything, Mom. Just rest and enjoy." The word enjoy suddenly made me nauseous. I froze the account that afternoon. When my son came home and saw the alert from the bank, the confrontation was quiet but thick like walking through wet cement. He didn't yell. He acted surprised. Hurt even. "Mom, why would you do that? Don't you trust me?" I looked at him, really looked, and saw a man shaped by my sacrifices standing in front of me with a smile that never reached his eyes. "No," I said. That one word tasted strange on my tongue, foreign, defiant, sharp like a splinter. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in months. Maybe longer. Solid. The next few days were a quiet unraveling. They didn't scream or demand or throw me out. That would have been too obvious, too crass for the image they had cultivated, generous caretakers, the good children who took in their aging mother. No, instead they punished me with politeness. Cold cups of tea left on the counter. Conversations that stopped the moment I entered the room. Invitations to outings that somehow never included me. My daughter-in-law switched to calling me ma'am as if I were a guest at a motel who'd overstayed her welcome. But silence can be a kind of weather. At first it chills you to the bone. Then you grow used to it, wrap it around you like a shawl. And in that quiet, I began to hear myself again. One afternoon, I sat on the back porch with my notebook. I used to write poems when I was younger. Nothing anyone would publish, but I kept them in a shoebox under my bed. Scribbled verses about growing up in Mississippi, about holding my husband's hand on a ferry, about watching my son sleep when he was still all innocence and dimpled knuckles. I hadn't written in years. That day I did. Not poems, not at first. Just thoughts. Simple ones. Honest. Angry. A list of things I missed. Control over my own money. Phone calls that weren't monitored or redirected. The freedom to choose what brand of cereal I ate without it being labeled bad for your blood sugar. I wrote I miss being asked instead of managed. That line stayed with me. A week after I froze the account, I received a call from an old friend, Evelyn. We'd been neighbors once, raising children with loose ponytails and stronger backs. She had moved to Oregon years ago, but we'd always exchanged Christmas cards until I stopped responding. Too tired, too overwhelmed, too embarrassed. But now I picked up the phone. "Helen," she said, her voice warbling with age but warm. "Lord, it's good to hear you again." I told her everything. I hadn't realized how heavy the words were until I let them out. They tumbled messy and ugly, but she didn't interrupt. She didn't suggest I must have misunderstood or that they probably meant well. She listened the way women of our generation know how to do without fixing, just holding space. "Honey," she finally said, "you still have a say. You haven't lost that." I cried then. Quietly. Into the sleeve of the cardigan I wore, even though it was 80 degrees. That conversation lit something in me. A flicker. I began researching. Calling community centers. Talking to social workers who specialized in elder advocacy. I told them the truth, not dramatic, not fictionalized. Just the facts. And for the first time, someone on the other end of the line said, "That's not okay." They helped me. Quietly. Carefully. They connected me with a woman named Rosa, who came to visit under the pretense of being a nurse evaluator. She looked young, but her eyes were old wise. We talked for an hour. "Do you want to leave?" she asked. I looked at the potted fern on the patio. It was dying. No one had watered it in weeks. The soil was pale and cracked. I don't know where I'd go. That's a different question, she said. But I didn't ask where. I asked if. I nodded. That was the beginning, not a grand cinematic escape. No suitcase in the rain. No slammed doors. Just small steps. Getting my own phone again. Redirecting my mail. Arranging for a financial advisor through the senior advocacy office to untangle the mess. I told my son I'd be moving out. His face was a careful performance eyebrows, lifted just enough to suggest concerned lips pursed like he might protest. But are you sure you can manage? He asked. I didn't answer. Not out of defiance, but because the question was already too late. I had already said yes. 2 weeks later, I moved into a subsidized senior apartment complex across town. It wasn't fancy thin walls peeling linoleum, but it had light. And a window that faced a park where children screamed and birds argued with the trees. The first night I sat in a chair with wheels that squeaked and ate soup from a can. It was the best damn soup I'd had in years. The days unfolded like old linen creased with memory, soft with use. I had no one to impress, no routines dictated by someone else's schedule. At first, the quiet was disorienting. There were no footsteps in the hall, no television blaring reruns, no voice asking if I had taken my pills, though I had been taking them before anyone thought to ask. For a while, I kept the television off just to listen to the hum of my own life. The rustle of the curtain when I opened the window, the creak of the fridge door, my own breath measured and even. I noticed the way light moved in the room, how it spilled in golden at 10 in the morning and cooled into blue shadows by late afternoon. Sometimes liberation is not thunderous. Sometimes it's the softest thing in the room. I began walking again, not far at first. Just laps around the courtyard garden. My cane tapped a patient rhythm along the path. I waved at others, mostly women like me, some older, some sharper, some slower. We smiled. Names came later. Friendship came even later still. But it came. There was Dolores from Unit 3C who made apple crumble every Sunday whether anyone came by or not. I told her once that her apartment always smelled like October. She laughed, and from then on, she called me poet. There was also Frank, a retired bus driver, who challenged me to dominoes and let me win only once. I liked that about him. And then there was my room. Mine. I put up pictures me as a young girl on a swing in Louisiana, my husband on our wedding day, my son when he still held my hand and whispered, "Don't let go" at the county fair. I didn't frame these to remember them fondly. I framed them to remind myself I had lived many lives. I wasn't just this version. I had been someone powerful. I was again. I started writing more seriously. Poetry came back like a bird returning to a nest it thought abandoned. I entered a small contest hosted by the senior center. The poem was titled Widow Woman Witness. It was about shedding roles, about being seen without titles. I didn't win, but they read it aloud at an open mic. People clapped. I smiled. It wasn't the applause that moved me. It was hearing my words fill a room. One day a letter arrived. My son. A typed note brief. Polite. He asked how I was. Said the kids missed me. No apology. No questions about why I left. Just facts they were selling the house, planning a move. He said he hoped I was settling in. He didn't sign it, love. Just his name, like it was a formality. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. That version of grief had already passed. Instead, I wrote him back. I told him I was well. I told him I forgave him. And I told him I had learned something valuable. Silence is a kind of violence. But truth is a door. I ended with this: you cannot rebuild bridges you pretend never burned. I didn't expect a reply, and I didn't need one. That was no longer the currency I traded in. Weeks passed. My hair grew out of its limp, tightly brushed style. I let it be wilder, let the white strands frame my face without apology. I wore bright earrings again, the ones my husband once said made me look like a storm in bloom. One Thursday I read a poem at a local library. Afterward, a young woman came up to me. She was no older than 30. Her eyes were full of something tender and raw. My mother, she started, her voice catching. She lives with us. I think I've been managing her too much. I never thought about how that might feel. I placed my hand on hers. Now you have, I said. She nodded. That night I sat by my open window. The world outside was full of traffic and dogs and sprinklers clicking to life. But inside, I felt still. I felt full. I made tea and sat down to write again. Not about pain, not about regret, but about the odd, exquisite pleasure of rediscovery. About how the body remembers how to stretch once you stop shrinking to fit inside someone else's version of care. Spring came slowly that year, like an apology too long delayed. At the edge of the courtyard, a magnolia tree burst into bloom, thick white blossoms curling like fists opening in forgiveness. I watched it from my window each morning, cradling a chipped mug of coffee that I now brewed exactly the way I liked, dark with a touch of cinnamon. It reminded me of my sister, long gone now, who once told me that a little spice in the morning makes you harder to swallow by noon. Living here had become more than refuge. It was resurrection. The routines I built were quiet but sacred. Every Friday morning, I took the bus 3 stops to the small market where the cashier called me miss with a wink. Every other Tuesday, I hosted a writing circle in the common room with Dolores and Frank and 2 more residents who had stories that made me weep, laugh, and sit in reverent silence. None of us had degrees in literature, but every one of us knew how to carry a world inside our ribs and spill it onto a page. I started sleeping through the night again. Not every night. There were still dreams that woke me. I'd find myself back in my son's house, invisible again. My voice drowned by the hum of the microwave or the clink of a wine glass on granite. In those dreams, I was always reaching for something, a key. A door, a suitcase I couldn't quite lift, but I would wake. And this time I would remember I had already left. I received a phone call one Sunday. The number blinked on the screen, familiar, hesitant. I answered with my name. My full name, not Mom, not Ma. Not the tired reduction of years of selfhood. "Hi," my son said. There was a pause. "I heard from Aunt Charlotte. She said you were reading poetry now." "I am. I didn't know you still wrote." "You didn't ask," I said, not unkindly, just clearly. He sighed. "Look, I know things. I know it didn't go how we thought it would." I let the silence breathe. "But I wanted to say thank you," he continued, "for the letter. For what you wrote. It made me think. I've been in therapy, actually. I'm trying to understand some things about you, about myself." I nodded, though he couldn't see. "That's good," I said. "That's a good place to start." Another pause. "I miss you," he said finally. "We all do." My throat tightened, but I steadied my voice. Missing someone is a feeling. Respecting them is a choice. He didn't respond right away, and I didn't rush to fill the silence. "I understand," he said eventually. "Would it be all right if we wrote letters, not about the past, just where we are now?" I considered it. The old version of me would have jumped at the chance, would have clung to the offering like a rope thrown across a dark water. But this version of me, she had learned to measure her yeses. "That would be fine," I said. "But I write honestly. You should be prepared for that." He chuckled sheepishly. "I think I'd like that." And that was the start of something, not reconciliation, not yet, but recognition. And that was more than enough. Over the following months, we exchanged letters, real ones with stamps and ink that smudged if you cried while reading. He told me about his job, about how the kids were growing up, how he was trying to be more present. I told him about my poems, my walks, how I was learning to paint small watercolor landscapes from YouTube videos. There was no rushing it, no pressure to rebuild what had broken. Just two people rediscovering the dignity of listening. One letter arrived on my birthday. Inside was a small photograph. My grandson holding a handmade sign that read, "Grandma's a poet." His smile was missing a front tooth. It made me laugh. I placed the photo on my desk beside my typewriter, the old one I'd rescued from a thrift shop, and cleaned until it hummed like memory. That day I typed a poem called Inheritance. It was about passing on more than silence, about choosing what kind of ancestor I wanted to be. I didn't want to be remembered as the woman who endured. I wanted to be remembered as the woman who reclaimed. When I walked into the courtyard later that day, the magnolia had begun to shed its petals. They drifted down like soft scraps of parchment covering the ground with white. A neighbor passing by said shame about the mess. But I didn't see a mess. I saw a tree that had spent the whole season being beautiful on its own terms. And now it was letting go. There's a certain beauty in the things that come undone slowly, like a knot you've lived with so long, you forget it's strangling you until one morning it just slips free. That's what life began to feel like. Not an escape, not even a revolution, just a gentle, steady untying. I found myself spending more time in the community garden just beyond the back gate of the complex. It wasn't anything remarkable. Some raised beds, an old bench that listed to one side a hose that kinked if you looked at it the wrong way. But it was mine in a way that mattered. I claimed a plot and planted green beans, cherry tomatoes, and basil. It wasn't the harvest that meant the most. It was the quiet permission to tend to something again, to place my hands in the soil and feel responsible for growth. Sometimes I'd speak softly to the seedlings, not out loud, just enough for the air to know my voice still had use. I'd say things like, "You're stronger than you look," or "Don't be in such a hurry, sunlight will come." And maybe I was speaking to myself. One afternoon in early summer, I brought a basket of cherry tomatoes to the front office. Janet, the receptionist, 50-something, tough as leather, but with kind eyes, accepted them with a surprised smile. "You're always sharing," she said. "Don't you want to keep some?" I shrugged. "The joy's in the giving." She looked at me for a moment, then said, "You ever thought of mentoring some of the younger women in the transitional housing program? Could use someone like you. Someone who's been through the fire and come out writing poetry." I laughed, but something in me stirred. A week later, I sat in a small circle of folding chairs, in the church basement across town. It smelled of coffee and old hymnals. The women were young, most under 30, carrying babies, backpacks, and bruises you couldn't always see. Some looked away when I spoke, others stared too hard. I told them my story, the shape of it. Not the whole jagged truth, but the arc of it. How I had been a mother, a wife, then a ghost. And how I became a woman again. "How did you know it was time to go?" one asked. I took a long breath. When I realized I'd become a story someone else was telling. They nodded in that way people do when you've said something they didn't know they were waiting to hear. I returned every Tuesday. We wrote, we sat, we listened, we shared tea in silence, and sometimes even laughter. They began to call me Miss Helen. One of them, a girl named Lacey, gave me a charm bracelet she'd made from yarn and beads. "You remind me of a lighthouse," she said. I wore it every week. And just like that purpose rooted itself into my days again. I'd thought dignity was something others gave you through respect, through kindness, through letting you keep your seat at the table. But now I understood dignity is claimed. Like land. Like voice. Like breath. One evening, I sat on the porch outside my apartment watching the moon rise, and Frank from across the hall shuffled by with his walker and a deck of cards. "Game." I smiled. "Only if you're ready to lose." He chuckled, lowering himself beside me with all the creaks of old age and unrepentant stubbornness. As we played, he asked, "You ever see your boy?" I shook my head. "Not yet, but we write." He nodded. "Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's all you get." "I'm not waiting," I said. "I'm just open." He laid down a winning hand. "Well, you better stay open to losing too." We both laughed until our chests ached. The next morning I opened my mailbox and found another envelope from my son. The handwriting was messier now, less precise. Inside, just a note. "I read your poem in the newsletter you sent. Inheritance." It made me cry. Not because of guilt, because I want to deserve it someday. I pressed the paper to my heart, not as a prize, not as proof, just as a recognition that sometimes the real gift is not in being seen, but in being worth seeing again. I stood at the window and looked at my reflection faint in the glass. There was my silver hair, my softened skin, my spine straighter than it had been in years. I smiled not with triumph, but with clarity. I was not a burden, not a fool, not a helpless relic. I was a woman who had walked away, and now I was walking forward. The summer deepened. By August, the air was heavy with heat, and the magnolia tree had traded its blossoms for thick green leaves that whispered against each other like secrets. Everything in the garden seemed to move slower, as if the sun itself had pressed a heavy palm on the backs of all living things, reminding them to rest, to breathe. I had never understood the beauty of stillness until I earned it. There were moments sitting in the quiet of my apartment with the fan humming and the distant chatter of children outside when I felt a strange ache, not sadness, but something like reverence. Like looking back at an old photograph of yourself and realizing how far you've traveled, how many versions of you had to fall away for the one now sipping iced tea by the window to exist. I began to get small requests from staff around the complex. "Could you talk to Margaret? She's new. Her daughter left her here last month and she's not eating." Or "Helen, would you mind reading your poem at the Sunday potluck? We need something soft to close the evening." At first I hesitated. I was not a savior. I was not a symbol. I was just a woman who had finally remembered herself. But perhaps that was enough. I visited Margaret. She sat in her recliner with the kind of stillness that looked like sleep, but felt like absence. Her room was too dark to clean. The TV muted on some talk show where women with perfect teeth debated loudly. I brought her a sandwich and said nothing. The next day I returned and brought a photograph of my husband. He used to say the world was too loud, I said. So we'd eat in silence and call it peace. She looked at me for the first time. The day after that, she ate half the sandwich. By the following week, she'd asked me about the magnolia tree, and I knew she had begun to root herself again. That was all I did. Sat, listened, showed her the gentle defiance of continuing. Sometimes survival isn't loud. It's not a roar. It's a hand on the table, a sandwich, a name remembered. My own name, for example, Helen Ruth Sinclair. I began writing it again at the top of every journal page. Not Mom. Not Mother Sinclair from hospital files. Not the unspoken name's burden mistake dependent. No, I was Helen Ruth Sinclair. I was someone who had nursed a dying husband with one hand and paid bills with the other. I was someone who taught her son to tie his shoes and now refused to let him tie her life into a knot she couldn't untangle. I was a woman who had turned 70 and instead of fading, began to bloom again. On my birthday, the poetry group surprised me. We met in the community room. There were paper lanterns strung along the ceiling, half of them flickering gently, the rest too stubborn to light. Dolores had baked her infamous apple crumble, and someone had brought sparkling cider chilled in a chipped glass pitcher. The smell of cinnamon wax and something warm that had no name filled the room. Frank stood up and read a piece he'd written for me, grumbling as he unfolded the paper. To Helen, he began clearing his throat. The loudest whisper I ever met. Everyone laughed, but I didn't. I let the words fall over me like rain. After the poems, they pulled out an old record player and spun an even older Billie Holiday album. The crackle of the vinyl was like breath between notes. And then someone took my hand, Lacey, from the church basement. "Dance with me," she grinned. "You're the only one who knows how to sway properly." I let her pull me up, and there beneath dim lights and peeling streamers I moved. Slow, sure, and unashamed. My body, this soft and weathered archive of pain and power, still knew how to claim space. The music wrapped around us, Billy's voice curling like smoke. "You go to my head." I closed my eyes. I had never been freer, not because I had escaped, but because I had chosen. The next day I stood in my garden plot again. The basil had bolted, sending up tall flowered stalks. I should have cut it back weeks ago, but I couldn't bring myself to. There was something beautiful in its defiance. In the way it refused to stay edible, useful, how it insisted on blooming even when no one wanted it to. I left it just like that. Some things I had learned are not meant to be trimmed into someone else's expectation of what they should be. Some things are meant to grow wild. That fall, the air changed. Not just outside with its crisp promise of endings and beginnings, but inside me too. There was a thinning of the noise in my mind, the kind that used to run in loops. What if should have, maybe if I had. The quiet that replaced it wasn't empty. It was spacious. I had room to breathe again. And breathing, truly breathing, was a rebellion I hadn't realized I was entitled to. My son visited for the first time in nearly a year. He called ahead politely, as if I were a stranger whose threshold he needed permission to cross. "Just me," he said. "Thought I'd come alone this time. No kids, no noise." I told him I'd meet him at the cafe down the street. Neutral ground. My home was mine, and I wasn't ready to open that door, not yet. He arrived 5 minutes early wearing the same navy windbreaker he used to play soccer in as a teenager. He looked older, tired in the way people get when they've been carrying stories they're too afraid to say aloud. We sat on the patio, 2 coffees between us. The waitress brought water, then disappeared like she understood. "I thought I'd be angry," he said, staring into his cup. "I thought if you left, I'd feel abandoned." I waited, but what I felt was ashamed. Like I'd become the man I swore I never would. I sipped my coffee. "You didn't become him," I said quietly. "But you forgot who I was. You stopped seeing me." He nodded slowly. "I thought I was helping. I told myself it was love. Control dressed as love is still control." He winced. Not theatrically, not for pity, but with the kind of honesty I'd been waiting for. "I went through the bank records," he said. "Everything you did was fair. Every transaction had a purpose. I told myself we were all better off if I took the reins. But that was for me, not for you." He looked up, his eyes bloodshot with effort. "I don't want to be that kind of son anymore." I didn't offer forgiveness. That wasn't what he needed. And I didn't need it either, not like I used to. What I needed was what I had already claimed, space voice truth. "But I said this, then don't be. You get to choose again." So do I. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We sat. And when he reached across the table for my hand, I let him take it. Not in surrender, not in reunion, but in witness. That evening, back in my apartment, I wrote a letter. Not to him, not to anyone really. A letter to the part of me that had once been afraid to leave, afraid to be alone, afraid to want more. It went like this: "Dear Helen, you were never meant to be small. You were never wrong for wanting light. It wasn't weakness that kept you in that house, it was hope. But now you know better. Love should not cost your dignity. Help should not hold your voice hostage. You left, and in leaving you began, again, and again, and again. Keep beginning. That's how we stay alive. With all my strength. Yourself." I folded the letter and slipped it between the pages of a book I kept by the bedside. It didn't need to be sent. It just needed to exist. That winter, I submitted another poem to a regional journal. To my surprise, it was accepted. They asked me for a photograph. I sent one Dolores took of me in the garden, crouched next to a stubborn eggplant vine, laughing with my hands in the dirt. The poem was titled "What We Grow." The closing lines read, "They called it ruin, but I called it bloom. They called it leaving, but I called it home." When the journal arrived in the mail, I held it like something sacred. Not because it was proof, not because I needed validation, but because I had spoken, and someone had listened. That's all I ever needed. That's all any of us ever really need. Not to be needed, but to be known.